Hi there, I'm Leisha Grabinski with Blue Sky. The federal government has released its budget, and now Canadians are going through the fine print. What impact will these numbers have on you here in Saskatchewan? We'll be joined by a political studies professor, Daniel Westlake. Saskatoon Grasswood Conservative MP Kevin Waugh will share his thoughts. And we have a policy analyst too, policy analyst and strategist with War Shield, an Indigenous policy and government relations firm. We also want to hear from you. So you can share your thoughts with us today, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. But first, here's David Shield with the CBC News.
Thanks, Leisha. Good afternoon. After a months-long hiatus, a high-profile trial into the death of 9-year-old Bailey Maurice has resumed in Saskatoon. Taylor Kennedy is charged with fatally hitting Maurice with her truck in 2021. After the crash, Kennedy told a Saskatoon police officer that she had microdosed psilocybin mushrooms and vaped cannabis in the previous 24 hours before hitting Maurice. On the stand today, she told the judge that what she told police was true. The court has yet to decide if her admission to police is admissible in the case. The 9-year-old was declared dead in hospital. The Crown and Defence also questioned a Saskatoon police officer this morning about training for sobriety testing. The coroner's inquest into the death of Jeremy Sabarin is entering its third day of testimony this morning. The 40-year-old was found dead in Moose Jaw police custody in October of 2021. The 6-person jury heard this week Sabarin shot and killed himself with a gun he smuggled into a detention cell. This after getting arrested by RCMP on a warrant for sexual assault. Mounties say they searched Sabarin 3 times, but they didn't find the small 5-shot revolver that was strapped to his thigh in a holster. And Moose Jaw police failed to search Sabarin when he was transferred into their custody, despite a policy requiring them to. Today is expected to be the final day of testimony in the inquest. Once it wraps up, the jury will be asked to conclude how Sabarin died. A small town in southern Saskatchewan says its fire service is in crisis. Strasbourg says it doesn't have the money to maintain its fire trucks, equipment, and haul, so they are asking the provincial and federal government for assistance. Kelvin Shaplansky is the town's mayor. He says many small towns are facing the same issue and need help.
Actually, in Strasbourg, we have 3 trucks, so we're not in too bad a shape there. They are aging, but the biggest problem we have is a new fire hall. Our fire hall is getting quite old and decrepit, and we need to get a new fire hall built. I guess the other thing is when the fire trucks, when they need to be replaced, new trucks are now bigger than they used to be.
The mayor says a new fire hall will cost around $2 million. A pedestrian bridge that is a major access point in Saskatoon's Meewasin Valley is still closed. A fire last week at Gabriel Dumont Park means a detour is in place. Andrea LaFond is the CEO at the Meewasin Valley Authority. She's hopeful the situation can be resolved quickly since there's only one way to describe the bridge's importance for park users.
Well, critical. I was just there myself biking, and and I've been on the trails this past weekend, so we're seeing over 2 million visits. It's hopping. So that detour does take you around the park and kind of interrupts that flow, but we're hopeful that we'll see a resolution here soon.
LaFond says the city is doing a structural assessment. It's not clear yet if the bridge can be repaired or will need to be totally replaced. At 3 minutes after 12 o'clock, it's 2 degrees in Regina, 0 degrees in Saskatoon. This is CBC News. The rising price of baby formula has some families on edge. According to Statistics Canada, prices jumped 30% in the last 2 years. That means more families are seeking help from charities. Angela McIver reports.
As Samantha Nicholson feeds her 5-month-old Lila, she can't help but think about the cost of formula.
Laying awake in bed wondering if you're going to be able to feed your kid it's a gross feeling.
Nicholson has 3 children under the age of 4. All were formula fed. She says in that time, the selection has dropped while prices skyrocketed.
Now it's $43.99 for the same amount that in 2021 I was paying $28.99.
Wendy Fraser is executive director at the North Grove in Dartmouth. It offers resources including food for families in need. Fraser says formula is a common request.
I would say of every 7 parents who come in asking for it, we're able to provide for 1.
The North Grove is one of several organizations that received provincial money last week to help pay for nutritional programs. But while Fraser says it will certainly help, a longer-term plan is needed to address the growing food crisis. Angela McIver, CBC News, Dartmouth.
A Boeing engineer who believes some of the company's planes could fall apart mid-flight is airing his concerns on Capitol Hill. Whistleblower Sam Salihpour is testifying before a U.S. Senate committee. He believes Boeing skipped crucial safety steps in the construction of its 787 Dreamliner planes, and that compromises their structural integrity.
I have raised these issues over 3 years. I was ignored. I was told not to create delays. I was told, frankly, to shut up. At one point, Boeing management got sick of me and raising these issues and moved me out of the 787 program into this 777 program.
The aviation giant faces widening scrutiny after a series of safety incidents involving its planes. Boeing strongly denies Salihpour's allegations. The company says it is fully cooperating with federal aviation authorities in their investigation. And Leisha, that's the news at 12 o'clock.
David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That is the CBC's David Shield. Let's go now to Ethan Williams, who has today's weather forecast. Hi, Ethan.
Hello, Leisha. And oh boy, what did? Yeah, I think that's all I need to say.
That's how you're starting it. Just
oh boy.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Ethan.
Yes.
We woke up today, and I was like, oh my goodness, here it is.
Yeah.
But I had a friend who sent me a photograph from April 20th, 2023. Now, I didn't verify it. I'm assuming she's correct. And there was a ton of snow that had fallen April 20th, 2023. So this is how it is. It's an annual thing where we're like, what? We forgot. Oh, this happens all the time.
Yeah, your friend is absolutely right. It was, April 19th and 20th of last year that we had a similar storm system bring through some snow to the province. The year before that, it was right around the same time we had a massive snowstorm in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The year before that, we had around this time in 2021, we had some pretty heavy snow in Regina. So yeah, seems like April kind of 17th to 20th range seems to be when these surprise storms come along in the province. And it has brought quite a bit of snow. We have some totals as of between 7 and 9 a.m. this morning. These are 24-hour totals. Let's start with the rain, first of all, because southeastern Saskatchewan, you got some rain from that Colorado low. Merrifield picking up about 20 millimeters or so. Carnduff about 14 millimeters. Bredenbury, that's near Yorkton, about 11 millimeters. And then the separate system moving in from Alberta brought some rain through southwestern Saskatchewan as well. The Leader area, 20 to 25 millimeters there. But some pretty impressive snowfall totals as well. Holbein near Prince Albert, 20 centimeters there. Emma Lake, about 16 and a half centimeters. Prince Albert, 13. Saskatoon, as of about an hour ago, we're up to about 10 to 12 centimeters of that very wet, sticky snow on the ground. Environment Canada also reports that in the snowfall warning in northern Saskatchewan, La Ronge, Pelican Narrows, up to the South End area, anywhere between 14 and 23 centimeters has fallen there. And in that area today, another 10 to 15 centimeters is expected. Total amounts by the end of the storm could be anywhere between 25 and 40 centimeters. So lots of snow there. That snowfall warning has been expanded southward and now includes the Melfort, Tisdale, Nipawin, and Hudson Bay area. Not quite as much snow expected for you folks, maybe 15 to 20 centimeters there. The bulk of that, up to 10 to 15 of that, going to be falling through the day today. Another thing to keep in mind is that through Saskatoon and through the rest of central Saskatchewan, probably another 5 to 10 centimeters for you folks today. For southwestern Saskatchewan, Swift Current up to the Leader area, kind of in that same range. For Regina, south central and southeastern Saskatchewan, where it's kind of been hit and miss for us. Regina, we're seeing a bit of a break from the moisture right now, and there's really no snow on the ground that I can see outside of our studio here. We're looking for that to kind of continue through the afternoon, maybe 2 to 4 centimeters for us by the time all is said and done. Very windy, of course, as well. Gusts in much of south and central between 50 and 70 kilometers an hour. We're seeing those gusting at the moment. Should also mention a few highways not recommended for travel. That includes Highway 102 between McLennan Lake and South End, Highway 905 along kind of north of South End is also not recommended for travel, and Highway 123 between the E.B. Campbell Dam and Cumberland House, not recommended for travel. Also have one highway in South and Central where travel is not recommended, and that's Highway 42 south of Dinsmore. So, of course, Leisha, we have visibility issues there and lots of that slushy snow on the road as well.
Mm-hmm. You need to call it white gold, not snow, because then we remember, oh, yeah, we need this.
Exactly.
And then we stop complaining about it. It is white gold.
Exactly. So. Yeah, between that and the good amount of rain that we got in some parts of the province, this is a promising start. Of course, we need a lot more, but hopefully this will help.
Yeah, absolutely. Ethan, thank you.
You're welcome.
That is the CBC's Ethan Williams. Right now in Regina, you are seeing a light snow shower at +1. And here in Saskatoon, light snow sitting at 0.
I'm Philip Bratz from the Pepicasis Cree Nation. This is Blue Sky with Leisha Grabinski. We're live from the traditional territories of the Dene, Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and homeland of the Métis.
Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland delivered her budget yesterday and set out the financial priorities for her government for the coming year.
We are moving with purpose to help build more homes faster. We are making life cost less. We're driving the kind of economic growth that will ensure every generation of Canadians can reach their full potential. And we're making Canada's tax system more fair by ensuring that the very wealthiest pay their fair share.
So today on Blue Sky, we'll get some political analysis of these priorities. We'll hear from Conservative MP Kevin Waugh. We'll hear what this budget says about the Liberal government's commitment to economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts about what's included or not included in this budget? You can call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, our guest for the show today is Daniel Westlake. He's a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. He is with me here in our Saskatoon studio. Daniel, welcome to Blue Sky.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm sure we're listening to that clip. I think it was pretty audible that we could hear some laughter, which I think is criticism from the Conservatives. So we've got a lot to unpack here. And we know that Saskatchewan has a full slate of Conservative MPs. So is this budget going to win any new votes from people in Saskatchewan?
I have my doubts. I think the reality of Saskatchewan is that it's a resource-heavy province. It's actually a reasonably well-off province, and of course, it's a western and rural province. And all these things bode well for the Conservative Party, and we haven't seen the Liberals be competitive really anywhere outside of Ralph Goodale's seat, and he's long retired, and Descente Mississippi Churchill River, which might be a little bit of a more interesting riding up north. So I don't know that anything in the budget would change that.
We did hear reaction from Premier Scott Moe, and I think we're familiar with the relationship that Premier has with the Prime Minister. So it may come as no surprise as to how he reacted to it. He did have some criticisms of the federal budget. So let's take a listen to what Premier Scott Moe had to say.
$40 billion federal deficit would equate to about a $1.2 billion deficit for Saskatchewan residents. That's just a little bit more than I think we're willing to bear, and very unfortunate that this is a government that just won't even try, won't even attempt to curtail, some of the spending or investments that they're making, and try to at least get close to balancing the books federally. Second, we had two asks yesterday. One was to increase municipal infrastructure funding. We see none of that, and we asked them to remove the carbon tax, and we see that actually increasing. So a swing and a miss on both of those fronts, I would say. Last but not least, some positive. Always end on a positive, my mother always told me. would be that after 5 years of collecting small business carbon taxation and holding on to that for 5 years and not applying any interest to it, they're finally going to return it to the small businesses. So finally, after they taketh away from Saskatchewan small businesses, they're going to give us some of their money back that they had essentially taken over the course of not only the last 5 years, but took it all the time during a global pandemic when those businesses certainly could have used those dollars. Take these strings off the housing funding that they have spent the last 2 weeks announcing and return that into municipal infrastructure funding so that we can actually have municipalities that can invest in the priorities that are important to them for the true growth of our communities. We understand housing is a priority, but not at the cost of municipal infrastructure funding. A house being built with no water or sewer services or garbage services is not that valuable to a municipality.
Okay, so that's Premier Scott Moe. Our guest today is Daniel Westlake, a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Premier Scott Moe talked about a number of things there. I am curious about the municipal infrastructure dollars that he had hoped for, and just help me understand the difference between what the Liberals have announced and perhaps what Premier Scott Moe would have liked to see.
So I haven't looked too much at the infrastructure stuff. I know that the emphasis in the Liberal budget was on building houses. That strikes me as something that matches the priorities in places like Toronto and around Vancouver, the places that are really seeing a housing price crunch. It strikes me that, housing prices are going up everywhere, including Saskatoon. We're not seeing the same levels of increases, I think, as are being seen in a lot of other parts of the country. So it's not surprising for me to see a bit of a mismatch here between, I think, a Liberal government that is focused on major urban centres and housing prices that have increased there, and the interests that Scott Moe is putting forward, which I think match more the unique interests of Saskatchewan.
Okay. So what is on the table then when it comes to housing, and can that benefit the people of Saskatchewan? Because I think I saw some numbers, and for sure it is much more affordable to buy a house in Saskatchewan, or a place like Saskatoon versus Toronto. But what the federal government is talking about, could that benefit especially younger people who are struggling to get into the housing market?
Yeah, I think there's probably some benefit across the country. Even if it's a major issue or larger issue in some place like Toronto or Vancouver, bringing housing prices down in Saskatoon is certainly going to be beneficial for young people here. But it doesn't necessarily match the priorities, I think, that Scott Moe has as a premier of a province with a very different housing situation than you might see really in most other provinces in the country.
What about his final note there? He was trying to end on a positive note, but it still was a bit of he wasn't totally thrilled with that. So what's your understanding of how this might benefit small businesses?
Well, as with any kind of decrease in taxes, or I guess in this case, not having to pay as much or getting a rebate out of the carbon tax, there's an advantage to it. It's more money in small businesses' pockets. And I think matches a broader affordability narrative that I think the Liberals have realized is going to be kind of the fight for the next year or so. So I think that kind of fits. And then the kind of backhanded compliment aspect to it matches a kind of resource-heavy province that gets affected more by the carbon tax than I think a lot of other provinces outside of Alberta. And so, again, none of this is all that surprising to me. It kind of matches the conflicts that have been happening between the federal government and Saskatchewan really for the last more than a few years now.
Yeah, it's been a very long time. If you're listening today and you'd like to share your thoughts on the federal budget that was just released yesterday and how it could affect you in Saskatchewan, give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email us, bluesky@cbc.ca. You're listening to us right now on CBC Radio 1, but we are also live streaming on our YouTube page again, so you can find that on our CBC Saskatchewan YouTube page. Our guest today is Daniel Westlake, political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Okay, so affordability, that is top of mind for a lot of people. Does this budget nail that? Is this going to make life more affordable for people?
Unfortunately, my answer is it's hard to know at this point.
Yeah.
My instinct, and the way that a lot of the literature says that the way voters vote on this stuff is the policies aren't the things that are going to move a lot of votes. It's what the policies do. So the question becomes, in the next year, do housing prices come down? Does inflation continue to come down? I don't think when people go to the polls next year, they're going to be going, okay, what was in the Liberal budget a year
Right.
ago? The question is, does this have an effect? And that's hard to know. There's a lot of factors that go into housing prices. There's a lot of factors that go into inflation. And I think any government's always in a tricky position because they kind of have to, not guess, they have a level of expertise behind this, but they have to hope that the policy interventions that they've announced are going to have the outcomes that they hope for. And there's never any way to know that for sure.
Yeah, and I guess the outcomes, would we see them in time for the next election, or are these housing initiatives meant to create change over the next number of years? You can't just like that snap your fingers and change things.
And this is the other thing. Their housing target, I think they said 2031 is when these houses are going to be, well, they're going to reach their housing target. And that's good for Canada, right? You can't change affordability overnight. You can't build houses overnight. But we're a year out from an election. So if the Liberal Party's concerned about their own electoral fortunes, they're going to have to make a dent in concerns over affordability a lot quicker than that.
Are there things that could have an impact when people go to the polls when it comes to affordability? I'm thinking about people who are paying childcare fees. The Liberals have moved quite a bit on that. Even the National School Food Program. What are your thoughts on that? Will that have an impact on people?
Yeah, I think certainly anything that can, any money that gets out the door very quickly, or any programs that people see the benefits of very quickly, I think that matters. I think when you have people making the decision kind of in October 2025, are they going to re-elect the government, they are going to be looking at things like, the line from the presidential election from years and years ago is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Usually it's the actual thinking is, all right, am I better off than I was a year ago? But I think if they can get money out the door for these kinds of programs, they can get the programs in place, then I do think that helps. Whether that erases what is now quite a substantial gap between them and the Conservatives is another question. But I think, if they can get... What
is the gap and how is this overall? How are the parties doing right now?
I think the last polling average I saw had the Liberals in around 25% and the Conservatives in around 40%. So we're talking 15 points here. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. We're a year out from an election, so that's also a lot of time for that to change. But this is the impact. If the Liberals are going to benefit from this, or they're going to be competitive for government as a result of this, the impact has to be substantial. They're going to have to bring costs down significantly, or they're going to have to get lucky from costs coming down significantly or inflation starting to become less of an issue. And it is worth noting here that this is not just something the government controls, right? There are other factors that can influence this kind of stuff, and and those factors will influence voters regardless of what Liberal policy is.
Okay. Let's bring in a caller here. And we do have a Member of Parliament, Kevin Waugh, standing by to join us in just a bit. But first, let's go to James in Saskatoon. James, hello.
Hi. How's it going there today?
Good. What are your thoughts? What's your reaction to the federal budget so far?
Well, I couldn't be more disappointed, to be honest with you, right? Because where I feel that this government has failed certainly not only Western Canada, but Canada overall, is they haven't focused in what really makes Canada the great place, and that's productivity of business. Like, we have not done anything to ensure that our resources get to marketplace, that our capacity to be successful on the world stage is improved. They go and they add additional taxes to corporations. They've gone to also inherent tax, right? And so that is money that can't be redeployed back into our economy. And it goes like this, right? If we thought as citizens that my federal government was spending my money wisely, then we might have no issue with this. But the issue is that this government has been a colossal failure on so many fronts. Like, clearly this immigration issue wasn't controlled by the Conservatives. It was borne by the Liberal Justin Trudeau government, and that in essence is where so much of this is flawed. I want immigration, don't get me wrong, but it has to be to a controlled degree. What we are seeing in the GTA, and basically this budget is exemplary of one thing. I have made a mess of everything, and I'm trying to clean up some of this mess. And it still isn't going to get to the root of the issue. People don't want to live in fourplexes, so that's my opinion.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your opinion, James. Appreciate that. That is James in Saskatoon. I can tell you've got something to say. Daniel Westlake, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember here that there are always trade-offs to be made between, especially in a country such as Canada. So I can pick up on a couple of things there. One is resource development versus climate change. The reality is if you're going to do something about climate change, it's going to impact fossil fuel provinces. And so what is good for British Columbia in this case is not necessarily good for Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the opposite is true too. And so that's a challenge that needs to be worked through. And then the second thing is just in terms of when we think about business tax cuts and versus spending on social programs, is another trade-off that governments have to make. There are going to be some people that benefit from investments in things like childcare and investments like a national food program, but the money's got to come from somewhere. And that means that you have to put taxes on I wonder if the Liberal government's going to raise enough money from these taxes, but you have to find some places to raise money, and that might impact things like competitiveness. So none of this is to say that the criticisms are necessarily wrong. It's the reality that there isn't just one single set of interests here, that there are a mix of different interests that have to be balanced against each other, and anything the government does to kind of try to fit one set of interests is going to create problems and I think justifiable criticism from people whose interests aren't being responded to.
Okay, I think this is a good time to bring in our next guest. Kevin Waugh is a Conservative Member of Parliament for Saskatoon-Grasswood, and he joins us now to provide his reaction to this budget. Mr. Waugh, hello. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Alicia, yeah, good afternoon. I'm from Ottawa. We're just getting involved right now in question period, but no doubt yesterday afternoon when the finance minister stood up, we were disappointed as Conservatives, the official opposition. More debt, $39.8 billion, just under $40 billion. This is non-sustainable, Alicia. They have got to stop this inflationary deficits. They did not stop, endangering our social programs yesterday. They did not stop the common sense Conservatives that we need to start governing common sense for this country, dollar in, dollar out. We had three asks yesterday. Axe the tax on farmers and food immediately. We talked about building homes, not bureaucracy. And the third one is, I think, the most important right now. As 9 budgets in, they have not balanced it once. And we're asking to cap the spending with the dollar-for-dollar rule to bring down interest rates and inflation. And that's the issue right now facing this country, Alicia, that you're spending $40 billion more than you're taking in, and sooner or later the chickens are going to come home to roost, and we're going to pay for this dearly.
So what would you cut? Or would you increase taxes if the numbers don't look right to you? What would your party do differently?
Well, we have to get back to balanced budgets. There's no question about that. It's tough.
But how?
In opposition,
What would be the Conservative strategy?
Oh, I can't. You know what? I'm not going to talk about cuts and what we're going to do, because some of our programs yesterday were introduced actually by the government. And, we're not going to tell you what we're going to do, what we're not going to do. But I can say this, 39.6 or 39.8 billion dollars over the budget is not a good recipe in this country. And we're seeing it with inflationary prices at the food store. We're seeing it on the mortgages, the 5+% that we're being charged now at lending institutions. When is it going to come down? I don't know. We've been hearing this for months, that it maybe comes down in February, maybe comes down in March or April. But you know what the issue is? Homeowners now are renewing their mortgages, and it's not pretty. They had 2% mortgages, and now they're coming up to 5 and 6%. And the reason being is the Liberal government's inflationary spending. They're causing this, and homeowners are going to see this when they renew their mortgage either this year or very soon.
What about for younger people, Gen Z, millennials, who can't get into the housing market, so they're not facing higher mortgage rates just yet because they don't have enough money for a down payment? What are some of the ideas that you have to address that?
Well, there's no question, Leisha, that life has gotten a lot more expensive for Canadians. We're seeing that. And when Trudeau came in 2015, and that's when I was first elected in 2015, we're just going to do, a little bit inflationary spending to help out the infrastructure. They've done none of that. So what are you going to say to the single parent that has one of their child's in the basement, 35, 36, still living there because they can't get into the housing market? Rents have doubled. Housing has doubled. Look at right now what we're seeing in Saskatoon. There is no inventory. Everything is going up. Single people, young people can't get into the housing market. There is no way. And I blame this on the Trudeau government since 2015, the inflationary prices. You can see clearly when Harper left and on and on. This is their ninth budget. They haven't done a darn thing for young people and single people and along with seniors in this country. And right now you feel for those because they're being shut out of the home market while rents in Saskatoon and the province of Saskatchewan have done nothing but gone up.
I'm speaking with Member of Parliament Kevin Waugh. We're going to take a moment to check in with our newsreader David Shield, but Mr. Waugh, I've got a couple more questions, so stay on the line for just a second, okay?
Okay.
Let's go now to David Shield, who joins us. David, what's making news today?
Well, the impaired driving trial of a woman charged in the death of a 9-year-old girl heard from the accused today. In court, Taylor Kennedy said she told police she had microdosed psilocybin mushrooms and vaped cannabis within 24 hours of hitting Bailey Maurice with her truck. However, a judge needs to rule on whether that information is admissible in this case. The town of Strasbourg says it needs money for a new fire hall. The town says its fire hall is old and decrepit, but doesn't have the money to buy a new one. The town's mayor says many small towns across the province are in the same position. And a snowfall warning is still in place for La Ronge, Pelican Narrows, and Cumberland House. Another 10 to 15 centimeters of snow is expected to fall through tonight and into tomorrow. 14 to 23 centimeters of snow had already fallen as of this morning. And I'll have a full newscast for you coming up at 1 o'clock.
David, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That is the CBC's David Shield. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You are listening to us on CBC Radio 1. We're also streaming live on our CBC Saskatchewan YouTube page. We've got Daniel Westlake with us today, a political science professor at the University of Saskatchewan. And right now, I'm speaking with Saskatoon Grasswood MP Kevin Waugh. Mr. Waugh, a few more questions for you. We actually just had a caller who says are doing wrong. And so I'd like to give you the opportunity to address that criticism. Okay, so I'm just going to say this one more time. So we did receive a call from a listener who says that he feels that Member of Parliament Kevin Waugh hasn't been saying what the Conservatives will do, just what the Liberals are doing wrong. And so, Mr. Waugh, I wanted to give you an opportunity to address that criticism and to create a bit of space for you to talk about what you would do differently, especially when it comes to housing.
Housing is the number one issue, Leisha. I hope you can hear me. I've had some mic problems here during your news update. Can you hear me okay right now?
We can hear you perfectly clear. Thank you.
I can hardly hear you. So, I'm going to plug in my mic here. We've just had some technical. Please stand by, as they say.
Yeah, no problem. You know what? I'm going to let you take a second.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you great, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm not on your YouTube, I don't think, right now. But, we've been saying a long time that the housing issue is a major issue in this country. Our leader, Pierre Poilievre, spotted this a couple of years ago. We're not building enough units anywhere in this country. We have seen bureaucracy in a number of, not only Toronto, Vancouver, but, I look at the city of Saskatoon right now. In my riding, if you go to Rosewood, land is very expensive, Leisha. You can spend up easily $175,000 to $200,000 just on a plot of land. Mm-hmm. And so it's obviously, you're not going to be your first home in Rosewood. I wouldn't think. You would work on your way up. But housing is a major issue. You go ahead.
Well, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us what the Conservatives would do differently? If you're concerned about red tape from what the Liberals have proposed, how would you make housing more affordable for Canadians? What would be the strategy to bring housing prices down? And I know they need to drop much more in Vancouver and Toronto than in Saskatchewan, but at the same time, I think it's fair to say that people struggle to get into the housing market. So what is the Conservative strategy on that?
I think the first thing is we've got to get our budget in federal politics under control. You can't spend $39.8 billion more than you're taking in. And that's the inflationary that we're seeing in this country today, why rates haven't come down. So if we've got to get our house in order, and I think the Conservatives will, I know we will get it in order when we become government, whether it's later this year or next year, as your host has said. The polling looks very good, but the situation we have in this country now is caused by Trudeau. They are spending way too much money federally here. The programs are not being rolled out. We know that for a fact, that their housing programs, their infrastructure has not rolled out in the last 8 years. So for us, we've got to get our house in order, the inflationary spending, and then we can bring down interest rates. And then when you bring down interest rates, you can bring down investment. And right now, that's what people want in this country. They want a chance to buy a home. They want a chance. And right now, there is no chance for young people, as you mentioned. They're stuck in the basement of their parents' home.
Kevin Waugh, I really appreciate you joining us today. I'll let you get back to your duties in Ottawa there. Thank you.
Leisha, thank you very much, and all the best, and take care today. The weather maybe isn't what it should be in April, but we know in Saskatchewan you're going to get the odd snowstorm.
We do. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Okay.
That is Kevin Waugh, Member of Parliament for Saskatoon-Grasswood. We've got Daniel Westlake with us, political science professor at the U of S. We've got a number of callers too, but I want you to jump in because I think that is an interesting question. Could this budget lead to higher inflation? Is inflation do we blame Trudeau for that? I don't know.
Yes, I have to be careful here because I'm not an economist.
Yeah.
And so this stretches my expertise a little bit. But one thing I'd point to here, and I think this goes for inflation, this goes for housing as well. There's only so many things that governments can control. And when it comes to inflation, we know, I think, from a lot of the economics literature, that government spending does contribute to inflation. But that doesn't mean that in this particular case it's doing that. That's something that, again, I defer to people with more expertise on this. But the other thing we know, and I think it's important to remember, is that there are things that are beyond government control that are going to affect both housing prices and inflation as a whole. So when it comes to inflation, we saw that across the Western liberal, kind of Western democracies, all experienced large amounts of inflation, which suggests to me there's something more going on here than just the Trudeau government and their behavior.
Right, because prices have gone up in Europe, everywhere.
That being said, it doesn't mean that their policies aren't affecting it. So you kind of have to be careful to assign, like there's a lot of blame for this stuff to go around. And the same is true for housing, right? Like we have increasing demand from housing as a result of an increasing population. The fact that kind of supply of housing, building housing hasn't kept up with that. That's not something that began with the Liberal government. Perhaps it got worse under the Liberal government. And it's something that I think you can look at past governments, you can look at the current government, and look at provincial and municipal governments as well that have some responsibility for this. So with all of these things, obviously politicians blame their opponents.
Yeah.
But all political actors probably have something, probably should be taking some share of the blame for this.
I want to ask you one more thing before we get to some callers, because I think intertwined in all of this is conversations around immigration. And we know, we've heard from the government, the federal government on this, on how they are changing course a bit, especially when it comes to international students. And then we've heard locally from international students who say they don't think our province can actually fulfill the promises it's making to newcomers, that there's no affordable housing, hard to find work, schools are at capacity, we don't have enough resources to properly help English as additional language students. And then the other layer to this is we've also been told that we may need to bring in skilled workers from other countries to actually build the houses that are needed here. So the question on that is, what role do you see immigration playing in this next year leading up to the next election?
So I'm not sure there's been like a huge jump in immigration this year as compared to what we've had from previous years. Immigration in Canada has been pretty steady over time. So I look at that and I say, the stuff around settlement, the stuff around housing, all of this stuff was predictable. Like, all of this stuff is things we could have been thinking about 10, 15, 5 years ago, and haven't made sufficient investments in. So I'm hesitant to say this is a question or a problem that results from immigration, when we know that immigration has been important to our economy. We need more immigrants for that reason. But rather a question of social investment and making sure that we're matching our immigration intakes, or I even say we're matching our investment in immigration integration to immigration intakes that have been relatively steady, and should have highlighted that these things were going to be issues that we would have to invest in. So I think we have to be careful about how we approach this. I think in some circles of politics, there's kind of this reaction, a knee-jerk, blame immigrants because, immigration does increase demand on housing, and there's costs to integration, without kind of the realization that these are social investments we could have made and perhaps should have made earlier, and these are things that we probably could have predicted.
Daniel Westlake is our guest today, a political studies professor from the University of Saskatchewan. We have callers. We'll get to you in just a bit, but I want to introduce folks to our next guest because the federal government has talked about investing in Indigenous communities, and that is something our next guest has been keeping a close eye on. Jennifer Lewitz is a policy analyst and strategist with War Shield. That's an Indigenous policy and government relations firm. She's also a member of the George Gordon First Nation, and we've reached her in Prince Albert. Jennifer, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, Leisha.
Thanks for being here. What stood out to you from the federal budget?
Ooh, a lot of big promises yet again that we see year after year. Actually, right before I came on here, I saw Alessia Pacifian with Canadian Press just dropped a new article that the AFN National Chief, Cindy Woodhouse, is actually denouncing this federal government budget. That was something that we were waiting to see and hear from, was our AFN National Chief. And the biggest thing that stood out for me, that also stood out to the National Chief, was the lack of budget promises for filling that infrastructure gap that is a huge problem for our nations.
Okay, tell me more about that. What is needed in terms of infrastructure? What kind of dollars were hoped to be seen in that area?
Well, I know last year the AFN was asking for, I think, around $60 billion by 2040. And this year in our budget, we saw around $918 million promised over 5 years. So falling considerably short of what the ask is to fill that infrastructure gap, and not just fill it, but bring it up to where other Canadian infrastructure priorities are currently at.
What are the infrastructure priorities? We use that word, but what are we really talking about? What is the need?
Housing, First Nations water, everything kind of in between in that area. Housing is a big thing right now. We just saw the Auditor General report. An audit came out a few weeks ago saying that the federal government is actually kind of dropping the ball on the housing situation. And when we talk about housing, it's not just thinking of building homes, but also alleviating some of the social issues that we see on nations. We're starting to hear about, like tuberculosis and stuff like that now popping back up, and other infectious diseases and stuff like that because of overcrowding in homes, and that's kind of an issue. So making sure that we're bringing that housing gap and filling it is important.
You were also paying close attention to the disability benefit. Now, some of our listeners might not know what that is. What is the history on the disability benefit? Why was that something you were paying close attention to?
It's something I was paying close attention to because I am a person that lives with a disability. I have a neuro disease that I was diagnosed with in 2019. And something that the federal government did promise was the disability benefit through Bill C-92. Carla Qualtrough was the Minister of Disabilities at the time when she introduced that benefit back in 2022, I believe. We got unanimous cross-party support on it, and it was finally royal assent in 2023. And then there was a widespread advocacy campaign from those with disabilities over the last year to see that funded. And then what ended up happening is we're hearing it's around $200 a month when it first gets rolled out. And now the disability community and other organizations like BC ANDS, which is an Indigenous disability advocacy group, are calling it abysmal, basically.
I want to ask you also about money for child welfare. What was in the budget for that?
Actually, there was a considerable amount offered for child welfare. I'm seeing $1.8 billion for exercising their jurisdiction. This was important. I know that child welfare through Bill C-92 is one of the government's biggest budgets through ISC. As somebody that works primarily with nations on child welfare, I am glad to see that those funding promises are still there and will continue to be, especially in the years to come, because a lot of these nations have just started the process, and it's it's capacity building. So it's not just a 1-year process. Some of them are 4 or 5 years long, doing the engagements and getting the lawmaking done. So seeing that continued funding is extremely important.
There's also money related to residential schools. So 91 million over 2 years to Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada to increase the support provided to communities to document, locate, and memorialize burial sites at former residential schools. And then also 5 million over 3 years to Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada to establish a program to combat residential school denialism. That's something I want to ask you about. Is there a rise in residential school denialism? How necessary is that to have that as a budget item in your mind?
Absolutely. There is a huge problem with residential school denialism. And, we've seen some media in Canada give space to residential school denialists. And this is a problem because not only are we up against this tide of needing to teach people the history of residential schools, but now there's almost this doubt that's being casted because it's not being done in a way that non-Indigenous people feel it should be done on. And we heard about the mass graves, and there was terminology used around that maybe some people were questioning, but then we're seeing, a jawbone was found in Star Blanket Cree Nation. And that really highlighted how Indigenous communities approach stuff like this when, we had a knowledge keeper and an elder come out and say, you know what, if there is bones or graves in the ground, they gave strict instruction to leave it as it is because we have our own views and cultural teachings around death. So really bringing in that support from the federal government so that they can hire external consultants, ground penetrating radar, whatever it might be that they feel is necessary. But also maybe there's some campaigns and stuff that are needed to teach people about the history of residential school because there seems to be, again, we're up against a tide of people that really are not understanding the history.
There's also a lot of talk lately about economic reconciliation. And so I'm wondering how this federal government is doing when it comes to spending on economic reconciliation. Like, how do you think this money will be spent to advance the economies and financial independence of Indigenous communities?
I was actually very pleased to see this. It tells me that the Liberals are listening to what the communities want because they have been advocating for this for years. It was in the 2021 Conservative platform. And, there has been Indigenous advocacy groups out there like the Indigenous Resource Network that have been advocating for this. I just did a media interview while I was at a conference last week saying, I'm not necessarily pro-resource development, but I am pro-nations doing what they feel is best and giving them the tools and the resources necessary to advance those interests if they so choose. And, I just heard the political science expert that came on before me say that Saskatchewan is very resource heavy, and that's absolutely correct. And making sure that if our nations do want to participate in that resource development, they have the ability to do so and that the federal government gives them the tools and stays out of the way so that it can happen.
Okay, there's so much ground to cover here, Jennifer, but I want to ask you about healthcare because that's always a big one. And some of it is going to pay for services directly and to build and renovate health facilities. But there's also $390.4 million over 4 years to build or renovate health facilities, including to support the virtual health hub led by the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. And then also money for things that maybe seem a bit harder to put a price on, $167.6 million over 5 years to combat anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare. Can you give us a sense of how you think that money may be spent?
I'm not entirely sure how they plan to spend that money, but what I can say about the health system is that we've seen, in provinces, provincially across the country, is that the healthcare system seem to be kind of a mess. And when you have society's most vulnerable, so especially Indigenous people, those are the ones that are going to be disproportionately affected by those failing healthcare systems. And one of the things I was hoping to see more of was a targeted approach through health when it comes to things like addiction, which unfortunately I didn't see out of this budget, but I'm hoping maybe it'll come in the future. But as far as health, I don't know entirely how they plan to spend that money, but I do know there needs to be more resources, especially in the healthcare sector when it comes to First Nations.
One last fairly large question for you to contemplate. So you are in Prince Albert, and you're a member of the George Gordon First Nation. Do you think this budget will win over any new voters in Indigenous communities across the province? Which party these days has the support of Indigenous people, which I recognize as a very diverse, large segment of the population, but I'm curious to know what you think.
I don't think it's going to draw in any more votes. I think, unfortunately, that ship has sailed. I was just with my nation helping them with some child welfare stuff a couple weeks ago, and a lot of people seem to be just disinterested. So whether or not people show up to vote will be a big question, and where that vote goes if they do decide to vote. You know, the NDP have kind of branded themselves very closely with the Liberals through the confidence and supply, which may hurt them because the NDP did have quite a bit of support amongst First Nations in Saskatchewan because of their reconciliation work and their outreach. I don't know where it's going to go. I have talked to some friends that I never in a million years would have imagined they would vote Conservative, and now they're leaning that way. So it's really hard to say.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. I'm sure we'll talk again. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That is Jennifer Leywitz, a policy analyst and strategist with War Shield. That is an Indigenous policy and government relations firm. She is also a member of the George Gordon First Nation, and we reached her today in Prince Albert. I'm Leisha Grabinski. This is Blue Sky. We've got a number of callers to get through, but I want to give our guest, Daniel Westlake, an opportunity to chime in. Do you have a sense of the Indigenous voter cohort, and how are the parties doing at addressing some of these very real, complex concerns that we just discussed a bit with Jennifer?
Yes, I'd be very careful here because I'm not an expert in Indigenous politics, so I would avoid comment. I think there are people who, particularly our policy analysts that we just had on, who can probably speak to that better than I can. I will say we don't know as much as perhaps we should about Indigenous voter behavior, in part because we've had problems. I mean, it can be difficult to get a good sense of small communities and how they vote. And so I'd be careful. I think...
Actually, maybe I should rephrase the question.
Okay.
Which party is getting it right? I'm sure there's room to improvement with all three. But again, we're a year away from an election, and so maybe instead of asking you about where the Indigenous voters might be leaning, are any of the parties connecting in a good way?
It's hard for me to say.
Or same thing, is it hard to say?
Yeah,
okay.
In part because I don't know that we've got great polling data on Indigenous voters, and in part because I'm not a member of an Indigenous community or an expert in Indigenous politics. I think there are people from those communities who can speak to that a lot better than I can.
That's fair. Thanks, Daniel. Let's go to some of our callers. We've got James on the line in Regina. Hi, James.
Hi, Lisa. I have a few points that I of contention on the whole issue of balanced budgets. The last balanced budget that I saw was a Blakeney budget. I have seen the Conservatives, when they took over, both provincially and federally, contest or say that they were going to balance the budget. They never did. They had the greatest debt was under Devine and Mulrooney. On the housing issue, the Conservatives in the 80s got rid of all of the cooperative housing programs across the country, which were great programs for building houses for people, not for not having developers enrich themselves. And the thing that Scott and Mo talked about with more infrastructure, I live in Saskatoon. I live in the core of Saskatoon. We don't need more infrastructure. If we want densification, we have to increase our current urban population by 4 times without building any more infrastructure. So we don't need the infrastructure part. We've got it already. What we need to do is densify our communities, and I don't see the Conservatives doing anything about that. In fact, they're against it because it hurts their developer friends. And that's and I am a former Conservative. I was a Diefenbaker Conservative. I was a Red Tory, and I supported those programs that helped housing, that helped people get into housing. I don't see that anymore from the Conservatives. All they want to do is help their business friends.
Okay. James, I apologize for saying you were in Regina. You are definitely from Saskatoon. I know that. Yes. Thank you for calling today, James.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to keep going through some of these callers, so maybe Daniel, just take note of what you really want to comment on. Mike in Regina. We'll talk to him next. Hi, Mike.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. What are your thoughts?
I have a couple of things I'd like to go through, so just let me know when I'm running over time here.
Will do. Go ahead.
I live in Saskatchewan. I have a very small, close-knit group of friends that I talk to about Mr. Moe and his group of thieves, the motel fraud, the healthcare out of province fraud that they're perpetrating, both derived from MPs' involvements and the corruption. This very fact that they will not increase the minimum wage. Like, the reality is that prices have increased for all of us, not just for housing, but for basics like food. They won't increase the minimum wage because they're very business friendly, wealthy in other terms.
Which is definitely a provincial thing. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the federal budget.
And I'm getting to that. The unwillingness of them to bargain with unions, like it's like the very words that were coming from Mr. Waugh, Kevin Waugh. He wouldn't answer any questions directly. He wouldn't put any planks forward in what they think could be done federally. And another thing that I would like to point out, everybody's up in arms about the carbon tax. Nobody talks about the fact that Stephen Harper brought the carbon tax in at the federal level. And I would find that interesting. One last aspect, it is provincial, and then I'll move to federal. The provincial budget has just been modified. They said they were going to be running a surplus, and now they're moving into a deficit. And what has come to bear in terms of the change in that budget, primarily, it's almost $500 million in money that they didn't anticipate until they got the check issued, and that's because of crop insurance. So there's been a big hit in the provincial budget because of, please let me finish, Leisha. Because of that, and that's directly related to climate change. If you look at the long-term impact and the rain that we collect here and grow with.
I do want to just interject, though, because we're trying to focus it on the federal budget, and there's obviously debt and a deficit to talk about there. And so I'm wondering your thoughts just quickly, because we want to get a couple more callers on, what your thoughts are on the debt that the federal government is now carrying.
The debt that the federal government is now carrying is actually well expressed with again, Kevin Waugh. He was talking about how, and Mr. Moa spoke to this too, the $1.4 billion of debt that the federal government's current deficit translates to in terms of Saskatchewan's portion of that. And yet he's just picked up $500 million in debt from crop insurance that's directly related to climate change. So I don't know why we have a problem with carbon tax. I think carbon tax is necessary for us to address this. The programs that the federal government are bringing in, I have to say I agree with the majority of them. It was a comment you made earlier, though, with your commentator there, Dan, about how the money that's being earmarked right now by the Liberals in the federal situation, it's not going to come to fruition quickly. And I think that that's a responsible approach, though. I think that the money that they're spending is what you guys had mentioned before. It's a purchase of intention for the future. And
Mike, I have to stop you there because the music's going to start to play us off. If I could stretch the show, I would, but we're going to have to wrap. So you've raised a lot of valid things. Mike, thanks for calling. That was Mike joining us here on Blue Sky. And I do try to give our guests one last opportunity to talk. There's been a ton of things happening on this show today. What last words do you want to share?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we have to think carefully about is trade-offs. We're at a point where government services are being stretched, where the government is committed to bring in a whole bunch of programs. And while I'm not sure if this debt is a problem, if we're going to keep spending on more things, we're going to have to bring in more money. And so that's going to have to be a conversation that Canadians have as we go into the next election. And it's one that I think is a serious and I hope a mature conversation that we have to have, in that either we are going to invest in more programs, in which case we are going to have to tax more, or we're not going to be able to invest in those programs and we can keep taxes where they are, but we can't do both.
See, the music. That's our cue. That's it for today. What a wonderful show. Lots of different perspectives. Daniel, thank you for being our guest today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
That's Daniel Westlake. He is a political studies professor at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm Leisha Grabinski. Tomorrow we're talking about how Canadians trash about 1 billion pounds of textiles each year. Is there a way to stop that? We're going to hear from a bunch of different people in Saskatchewan who have creatively been thrifting, repurposing, and recycling fabric. So it's a great show tomorrow. Please join the conversation between 12 and 1 right here on CBC Radio 1.